All right, y'all. I got a story time for y'all tonight, and it's about a Avatar: The Last Airbender character. She goes by the name Hama. She was introduced in season 3. She is a bloodbending axe kind of woman, right? So let's tell a story. Let me tell a story from the beginning. Hama grew up in the Southern Water Tribe. She was a Southern Waterbender. Back when she was, there was a lot of Southern Waterbenders, and they did their thing. There was the North Pole and the South Pole, and the Waterbenders were there, and she was part of the South Pole Waterbenders. During Iroh and Ozai's father, during his reign, that's when they went down there and they went down there and they invaded the Fire Nation. Did. The Southern Raiders began their raid on the Southern Water Tribe. They knew that Aang was probably dead, or they didn't know exactly. There's a possibility this airbender is dead, and the next avatar will be born into the water tribe. That would be an issue for the firebenders. Correct. Because water can take out fire, right? So they were like, we're going to head them off early. We're going to make sure we get down there and we, stop the issue from being an issue, right? They go down there and they're all fighting off these, Fire Nation soldiers, but they send a whole bunch of people, man, and like so many that um, during Katara's time, the ships were still there. The old Fire Nation ships that they, came in on were still there. But anywho, she was caught. She was like the last fighter left, is what she told them, right? That's what she told them. She was like one of the last ones fighting and shit, and then she got took. Now, when she got taken away, it wasn't all, cool, right? They kept the water away from them. They went malnourished. They went malnourished. You know, they would keep water away from them at all times so they couldn't bend water. Treated them like animals, right? She got creative. She started to think, as a creative waterbender, right? She was like, "Oh my God, water is not just that; it's liquid. So any liquid I can control." She started controlling the mice in the prison. She started to but she was doing shit like this. She had to use her hands and shit and like wave her hands around and and she was able to make a move. Once she perfected that, she was able to then do it to the guards. But it would happen, under a full moon. That's when her powers were truly active. She got out of that prison, right? And then she retreated into the Fire Nation. Now, this woman had been through a lot. She was taken away from her people. They were, malnourished in prisons and shit, right? By the Southern Raiders of the Fire Nation. But she came up onto a village, right? These villagers of the Fire Nation don't know shit about that. They know that he calls to Fire Lord, sells a Fire Lord, Zulan the Fire Lord, whoever the fuck the Fire Lord is, and they just bow their heads to that shit, right? She is there, and she's like, every full moon she would take somebody down to the mountain and have them work slave labor. But she'd been doing this shit for years, y'all. See, she got freed by the time she was in her 30s. See, by the time Aang and all them came around, she was in her 80s, 90s even. She was old, cracked out. She's like, I'm old. I'm just an old lady that lives in this house all by myself. It's lonely out here. And you're a waterbender too, Katara. And Sokka was kind of like, old woman living out here. And then they heard the tales about, people disappearing and shit. And they're like, something don't add up. And then she's a waterbender too in the Fire Nation, right? She starts to teach waterbending to Katara, which is a cool move, right? Is what you would think. She's like, you could take waterbending even further. You can extract the moisture out of plants, and then the plants die, but you summon water. You can summon water from thin air, H2O. That's water, right? And she just pulls the water molecules out of the into air, and she can create it like that. She was like, you have to know how to waterbend. It's like much, greater than you make it. And she was like, oh, well, I remember doing the sweat thing because Katara had, created waterbending through sweat, liquid and, the sweat. She was able to, cut herself out of a jail cell. But Hama taught her all those ways to, use waterbending. But she was like, I'll show you the pinnacle of waterbending, what a true waterbender can attain, in this lifetime. And I think you have what it takes. She started using bloodbending. If you take Katara, you have to continue my work. You are the one who's supposed to, continue this shit. Because once I'm gone, there'll be nobody to do this shit. She forced, or Hama forced Katara after Hama was controlling Aang and Sokka. Toph was like, there's people in the fucking cave. She went down there to find those people. She had them doing slave labor for her, But she only did that during a full moon. She was, and then, Katara used bloodbending axe to, put Hama down. But Hama, it was sad, her story, right? Because she, you know, at first it's like, I feel bad for her because they went and they took her and, she didn't ask for that. She didn't ask to be taken away from her people and to, be enslaved and all that shit, right? Or, malnourished in the prisons and shit, right? She got out. But then for 50, 60 years after that, she was basically, doing the same thing, but to people who they weren't the people who, made her malnourished. They weren't the people who came to the Southern Water Tribe and raided on her. She wanted to make somebody else feel that pain that she felt. That's not revenge. That's, foolishness. I'd say, a person who was truly after revenge or truly vengeful person would try to go after those people directly, the people who actually did that to her, right? She was doing that shit for a long time too. And a whole bunch of people in the Fire Nation. These people of the Fire Nation, right? You gotta understand this, man. They are citizens of the Fire Nation. They're just doing what other people tell them to do. They're just fucking, sheep to a slaughter, or if it was like that, right? Or and it basically was, a dictatorship or whatever. And they just do that. They also had no idea about what she'd been through. Now she did have to, come back from some shit though, right? You know, my whole point is if I was her, I would do what Katara did later on. She went and she confronted the guys directly. She was like, who was the person who came to my village and did that last raid on the Southern Water Tribe? If I was, thinking like, in those ways, it would have been, a better story for her. But she was, kind of evil bitch, she became twisted and, power hungry. She was like, I know the pinnacle of waterbending. And she was, because she knew that. Later we find out about, males who can use it. They don't even have to put their hands up. They can just, because they use more mercury energy, they think. So they're like, they don't even have to put their hands up and shit. They can just make that shit happen. Still controlling the water in their bodies and other things, right? And even, tree blocking and cutting off, bending flow, right? For benders to where they can't use their bending, right? But she was the first, like, to show that kind of, darker but, powerful side of, bending, which is blood bending. You know, but like her hater, she did that. And she was actually on that list I made, the water benders. Um, I say in real life, there's, bitches who do shit like that. There's men who do shit like that. There's people who are manipulators like that. You gotta be careful because you might end up in their clutches and they'll be, before you know it, they're like, manipulating your life. And like, that's once you like let shit get out of control. You gotta like see those signs before the shit happens, right? You know, they ain't catching me like that. I'm the avatar, right? But be cool, go on the corner, and um, you know, don't fall for the Hama axe. Be cool, go on the corner.